Well, hello, my friends. This is Greg, and I'd like to welcome you to episode 10 of the Life, Love, God podcast. This is the autobiography of Norman Paulsen, who was a direct disciple of Paramahansa Yogananda. So today, I would like to cover chapters 9 through 12. And the reason they've all been lumped together is they all have to do with the same subjects primarily, and that is Norm's experience in the Merchant Marine and in the U.S. Marine Corps. And so we put all this nautical and military history into this podcast. So as we start in the first chapter, Off to Sea, World War II has ended. And we remember that Norm's mother and stepfather had been in a terrible accident, which had left his mother bedridden and in poor health for some time. Because she was no longer working at Lockheed, she was bedridden. Norm wanted to join the Merchant Marine in order to earn some money to support his mother and stepfather. The problem was he was only 16 and a student at Burbank High School at the time. He had to be the age of 17 to join the Merchant Marine without getting his parents' permission. So he had already received an early permission from his mother and stepfather about the Merchant Marine, but he went home and he found his birth certificate. He put it in the typewriter and changed the birth year from 1929 to 1928, which would make him 17 years old at the time he was applying for his seaman license. So when he arrived at the Coast Guard office to get his seaman's papers, the officer examined the birth certificate and said that he would have to go and have the birth certificate notarized before he could accept it. Well, Norm was kind of dejected at hearing that, but as he walked down the streets, he actually found himself on a side street and found this elderly woman who was a notary public, and she agreed to notarize his birth certificate after he told her about his mother's illness and the fact that they needed financial help. And she said, "You know, you're a big boy for your age. No one's going to care anyway, are they?" And so she notarized his birth certificate, which he took back to the Merchant Marine Center, which was at the Terminal Island Ferry Building. So Norm said goodbye to his family after his papers were accepted, and he went to San Pedro to the ferry building to wait for his assignments from the Merchant Marine. Norm's friends that he had signed up in the Merchant Marine with, both Don and John, they got their papers very quickly, but Norm wasn't called, and he felt very alone. Both his friends were already aboard ship, and he prayed for direction, and a voice came to him. He wrote, "A strong inner command came back. Wait 2 more days." And so after 2 days, a call went out in the Merchant Marine Hall for an able-bodied seaman. That's someone who's experienced and has been trained. And nobody responded. So Norm walked up to the dispatcher's desk, and the dispatcher said, "Do you want to go to sea? I'm going to ship you out as an able-bodied seaman. You want the job?" And then he pointed out through the window. He said, "There she is, son, the Tumakakori." And so Norm received his papers for the Tumakakori. And as he approached the ship, the bosun on a Merchant Marine vessel was somebody in charge of the crew, was an old Norwegian. And when he was handed Norm's papers, he started yelling, "What in God's name is the dispatcher doing sending me a green kid who's never been to sea before in the position of an able-bodied seaman?" And basically, he promised to make Norm's trip on this ship a living hell. So Norm was assigned the first watch by the bosun that night, and he completed 4 hours on the bow watch, and then he went to the bridge for wheel watch. Well, wheel watch meant he had to steer the ship during the night. Well, no one had taught him anything or explained anything to him, and yet he was expected to steer this giant ship. So after wheel watch, Norm heard over the ship's speakers, "Where's that dumb jerk who steered this ship all over hell on the 12 to 4 watch last night? Send him up here on the double." So the captain was waiting on the bridge for Norm, and when he saw Norm, he said, "What the hell's wrong with you? Were you drunk?" And then the captain learned that Norm was Danish, as were all the officers on the ship. And the captain reprimanded the Norwegian bosun because Norm explained that he was never taught to do anything, he was just assigned. And so he made sure that Norm was shown the ropes from that point on. One evening he was standing bow watch at 1 a.m. in the morning. Now, bow watch was pretty important because this was right after World War II. The seas around some of the islands that they were sailing to, the Philippines and Guam and Saipan and Hong Kong and other ports of call had been surrounded by Japanese mines. And so bow watch was very important because you were the last watch between that and a mine being right at the bow of the ship that would be hit during the night. So as he's out on bow watch that night, he felt like he was being watched. And he turned toward the starboard side of the ship, and suddenly there was a gigantic orange flash that occurred in the night sky, followed by the colors of the spectrum emanating outward and downward. The light orb just appeared to hover in a stationary position over the water. Suddenly there was another orange light and appeared off the port side. So Norm called the wheelhouse to report, and at first it was thought it was signal flares. Then a few seconds later, a brilliant orange light appeared dead ahead, about 3 miles ahead of the bow. The 3 lights remained for over 5 minutes and did not descend or change positions like a flare would have. The wheelhouse told Norm there was nothing on the radio or no distress calls. They were unable to see any other vessels. So Norm asked one of the officers, he said, "What are those lights?" And Mr. Thiessen responded in the wheelhouse, "Don't know, Paulsen. I really don't know. You just stand there. I'm going to get the captain." So he went to get the captain, and by the time the captain made it up to the bridge out of his bed, the lights were gone. And later, taking his shift in the wheelhouse, Norm asked Thiessen, "What do you think those lights were?" And here was the interesting answer that seasoned sailor gave him. "I've been to sea most of my life, but never saw anything like that before. The sea is a strange place. Strange things happen out here. Old seamen's tales are not all superstition." So I'd like to share a personal story here, and I haven't shared a lot of personal stories in these podcasts, but these orbs, which later in his life Norm would refer to as ships of light, these orbs have been seen by many. In 2001, my wife and I, Elena, were managing the Santa Barbara Greek Festival. And on the last night, which was a Sunday night, we stayed late till all the vendors had packed up and taken down their tents and all the electrical had been unhooked and everything had been returned to normal. We got out of the park there in downtown Santa Barbara at about 1 o'clock in the morning, and we drove up over the mountains to return home. And as we drove over Cachuma Pass, and Lake Cachuma is on the other side, we saw something that startled both of us. And that was a set of 3 lights, but repeated 4 times. So there were 3 lights, and then another 3 lights, another 3 lights. So there were 12 lights altogether in a formation. And I wasn't sure whether I was looking down on something or I was looking up at something. It was a very strange illusion, and I thought, well, maybe we're looking at a blimp, with lights underneath it, or maybe there's a couple of helicopters there, and maybe somebody's down in the water and they're shining up and there's a cloud base that we're getting reflections off of. But as we watched those lights, we had looked at each other and said, "Are you seeing what I'm seeing?" And she said, "Yes, I'm seeing it too." And then suddenly, all 12 lights dispersed in 12 different directions all at once, leaving a trail of light in 12 different directions. I know that these lights occur, and I'm almost certain that what I saw were ships of light. And why they were in that formation, why they were near Santa Barbara, I don't know. But I too have seen these lights, and you never forget this kind of an experience. Well, one evening, Norm was approaching the mess hall for dinner when another seaman blocked the doorway and said, "Paulsen, you're not coming through this door." Norm, thinking the other seaman was joking, basically started to step through the doorway when the other seaman began to wildly punch and try to land punches with his fists and shouted, "I'm going to mess you up, Paulsen." So Norm moved back to avoid being hit and to defend himself, but suddenly he felt a familiar presence. And it was a presence that he had felt when he was being chased after school as a elementary school student. And that voice had come to him and said, "Stop, Norman, turn around and chase them." And he'd done so, and all the boys had run away from him. So Norm stepped forward, and he began to feel this power emanating from his upper spine out through his shoulders and arms and hands. And then he wrapped his arms around this raging sailor in a bear hug. He picked him up over his head, and he threw the sailor about 10 feet. And the sailor, when he hit the deck, was instantly unconscious. Now, in the story, Norm says the sailor would spend the next week in bed recovering. And Norm was to find out that that seaman was considered to be the toughest man on the deck crew. But Norm was upset that he'd hurt somebody, and this caused fear to run through his body. And when that happened, a voice came to Norm, and the voice said, "He's all right, big boy. He needed to be taught a good lesson." And then Norm writes, "On that day I realized fully that unseen companions existed around and about me. I had yet to meet them, but I knew I would someday. The companions counseled me to never start a fight, to try in every way to avoid one if possible, to live a clean, humble, and virtuous life to the best of my ability." But here's an interesting thought. Go back to that voice and what he said. He said, "It's all right, big boy." Who called Norman big boy? Well, I'm going to tell you the story of Kashi. This actually comes from the autobiography of a yogi. And Kashi was a student at the Ranchi school and someone that Yogananda loved a lot. And Kashi got sick. And as he lay dying, he said to his master, "If I die, will you find me when I'm reborn and bring me back to the spiritual path?" he asked amid sobs. And Yogananda answered, "If Heavenly Father lends his aid, I will try to find you." And Yogananda wrote, "My love for Kashi and the pledge to find him after death night and day haunted me. No matter where I went, his face loomed up before me. I began a memorable search for him, even as long ago I had searched for my lost mother. Using a secret yoga technique, I broadcasted my love to Kashi's soul through the microphone of the spiritual eye. With undiminishing zeal, I practiced the yoga method steadily for about 6 months after Kashi's death. It looks as though I've located Kashi," I exclaimed. "Kashi's soul must be living in the womb of some mother whose home is in this lane. A male child of fair complexion will be born to you," I told the father. "He will have a broad face with a cowlick atop his forehead, and his disposition will be notably spiritual. I felt certain the coming child would bear resemblances to Kashi. Later I visited the child, whose parents had given him the old name of Kashi. Even in infancy he was strikingly similar to the appearance of my dear Ranchi student. The child showed me an instant affection. The attraction of the past awoke, and it redoubled intensity. Years later, that that boy as a teenager wrote me during my stay in America. He explained his deep longing to follow the path of a renunciate. I directed him to a Himalayan master who accepted him as a disciple, the reborn Kashi. So I tell you this story because there's a lesson here that I think it's good for all of us to understand, is that when we are a disciple of a guru, and our last guru in our lineage was Paramahansa Yogananda, that guru will look after his disciples through all incarnations. Just as he was looking after Norm and giving Norm those reassuring words, he'll be okay. He's not hurt, big boy. He just needed to be taught a lesson. So our guru looks over all of his true disciples to help them on their path and to aid them when it's necessary. Later on during this same journey in the Merchant Marine, he was looking out from the deck of the ship to the stars. And he was just thinking, he was in kind of a peaceful, solitary reverie, and he thought to himself, do other stars have planets like this solar system? Yes, came the reply, many do. An audible voice that he could actually hear. And people also? They're not all the same as you, but similar. Could there be an end to the universe out there? Yes, just beyond the farthest stars, the rim of creation exists as this great sphere of creation floats in the vast, eternal sea of life and energy, thatness. And then Norm wrote, paraphrasing an old mariner's poem, O Lord, thy sea is so great, and my boat is so small. After 6 months at sea, Norm arrived once again at San Pedro. Captain Anderson of the Tumakakori offered Norm to sign on for the next voyage as his quartermaster, but Norm wished to see his family. He first went to see his mother and his stepdad, Don. Norm's mother's condition was not getting any better. In fact, it was still declining. But Norm had earned $3,800 plus his room and board on the Tumakakori, and he gave $3,000 to Don and his mother, and then he used the rest of the money to buy a car. When it came to the question of what Norm would do now, Don suggested joining the Marine Corps and learning a trade of some sort. And he said with military benefits you could finish your education afterwards. And Norm decided then to visit his dad and Dorothy in Santa Barbara. Norm's father said about joining the Marines, it would not have been my choice, but it was okay with him. So on April 1st, 1946, Norm enlisted in the Marine Corps. Norm's first thoughts on reporting to the Marine Corps recruiting depot in San Diego was, goodbye, freedom, what have I got myself into? And he wrote, after 2 weeks of basic training, it felt to Norm like kill or be killed, suicide mission or worse. When he finished boot camp, he was assigned to the Veteran Marine Fighter Squadron 452 at El Toro Marine Base, California, to the communications office. And every weekend he would hitchhike home to see his mother. He wrote, her life was fading away and there was nothing that could be done to help her. One Friday morning in June, the desk sergeant brought Norm a message from Don. Your mother's in the hospital in Burbank. Come quickly as possible. Norm wrote, that evening I walked into her room at the hospital for the final time. I knew looking at her that this would be our last meeting in the world. She was hemorrhaging and had to be taken to the operating room for a transfusion. She said, don't say goodbye, son. Just say, I'll be seeing you. And she handed him a sealed letter. Norm wrote, I tried not to cry, but didn't succeed very well. I kissed her on the forehead, holding her hands. I leaned past and her body was taken the next day to Forest Lawn in Glendale, California. But suddenly Norm had found himself alone, without a real family. What did his mother's letter say? Well, I'm not going to read you her whole letter. You can read that for yourself in the book. But I want to point out a couple of things from her letter. She wrote, "Your last letters telling me that you had found God out on the lonely ocean pleased me so much. I cannot tell you." So there were experiences that we don't even read about in this autobiography that had produced much spiritual growth for Norm during that 6 months. And then she said, "Try to grow up to be a good man and amount to just enough to be happy. Remember, your mom has always loved you." And then she closed her letter saying, "Mommy will be watching over you, and I will be in the sunsets and out on the ocean and in the nice clear breeze. I will always love you, darling. Mommy." And so Eileen left this mortal world, but she left her mark on her son, Norm. She was a force to be reckoned with. In 1920, women had just received the ability to vote in elections. And by the 1930s, Eileen was running for state representative. In fact, she ran for state assembly twice in California. She lost both elections, but she spent her entire campaign going everywhere talking about her policies and what she'd like to see change. She was also the head of the PTA for the Lompoc Valley. And as the head of the PTA, she was often asked to speak to other PTAs at the state that were not as successful as Lompoc's PTA. She also was an officer and president of the Alpha Club, one of the first women's clubs in Lompoc. In 1920, the Carnegie Foundation had gifted, through donations, the money necessary to build libraries, and Lompoc won one of those contracts. And so the Carnegie Foundation built the library on H Street, which is now the Historical Museum. Well, the foundation built the library, but there were no books. And so the Alpha Club, with the help of all their women leaders, were able to raise the funds to purchase the books, to put books finally in the library. And that's another project that Eileen Prosser had worked on, including putting up a World War I memorial and flagpole on H Street and Ocean. Also in the 1930s, Eileen was appointed by the governor of California to the California Water Board, which were in the process of developing rules and regulations to protect water sources in California so that agriculture would have its water and municipalities would have their water. This was a very important job because California has always and always will have a water problem. Eileen certainly was a force to be reckoned with, and she passed on to her son, Norman, those qualities of leadership, of organization, and of caring for others' needs. So, thank you for your attendance for this podcast today. I hope that it's left you with things to think about, to meditate about. If you want to purchase your own copy of Life, Love, God, there's 2 links here that you can use. Please subscribe to the Sunburst Sanctuary YouTube channel and leave comments, particularly if they're positive, on our podcast. And tell your friends about the podcast YouTube channel. For our next podcast, please study Chapter 13, I Find the 2 Large Dark Eyes.